Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking Point, tackling systemic racism in Kansas City. I'm Kristen Roberts, Vice President of News for McClatchy. Perhaps you're watching us via the homepage of the Kansas City Star, or you saw an email from our opinion editor or a tweet from a colleague. However you found us today, thank you for joining. George Floyd's death has ignited weeks of protests across America, and our journalists have stood witness to these events, recording the voices of this protest movement, capturing breathtaking photos and live videos, and at times subjecting themselves to the very same tear gas and rubber bullets that have met even peaceful protesters. Ida B. Wells once said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And my promise to you is that we will continue to document the events taking place around America. Today, as part of that mission, we turn our attention towards solutions. We've gathered leaders, activists, and elected officials to help explore specific issues related to race, law enforcement, and systemic racism in our communities, as well as the policy changes needed to address racial disparities and racial bias. While this crisis is national, indeed global, change will happen at the local level, and I hope these discussions bring you insight, add value to your conversations, and encourage change in our communities. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce Kansas City opinion writer and editorial board member, Toriano Porter, who will lead today's conversation.
Thank you, Christian. I really appreciate the introduction. Hello, my name is Toriano Porter, and I'm an opinion writer for the Kansas City Star's editorial board. Welcome to Breaking Point, tackling systemic racism in Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you for joining us for this important virtual conversation. Over the next hour, we'll address a number of issues with an influential group of panelists. Before we introduce our first panelist, I wanted to take a moment to wish Jackson County Sheriff Daryl Forte a full and speedy recovery from injuries suffered in a recent vehicle accident. The sheriff was originally scheduled to join us today, but was unable to make it. Thank you, Sheriff, and here's to a clean bill of health. For people that's tuning in live, feel free to join this discussion on our webpage at kansascity.com, as well as Facebook and other social media channels. I'll begin shortly by introducing our first guest. First panelist is Kevin Willmott, an Oscar-winning filmmaker and professor of film studies at the University of Kansas. Mr. Willmott won an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for the 2008 film *BlacKkKlansman, a movie Willmott wrote with Spike Lee. Professor Willmott, thank you for joining us, sir.
Good to see you.
Recently, I had an opportunity to watch you at a protest rally in Frontier Park in Olathe, Kansas. Now, here you are with an Oscar Award on your mantle. You've been in the community. What makes, why do you feel it's important that people like you with name and stature stay on the ground with the people?
Well, I think ultimately that's kind of what it means to be an American, really. America is a great country, but it's only great because we participate in the democracy. And if we don't participate in the democracy, then things go really, really bad, and they go really wrong very quickly, actually. I think we're learning it right now. And so for me, it's always been part of the responsibility of being a citizen. And of course, there's the extra kind of motive that being a Black American, you're kind of required to look out for your fellow African Americans. Obviously, we've been struggling with a lot of issues for a very long time, and so when you do kind of get an opportunity to support the cause, I think it's always important to try to step up and do that.
Okay. Now, you recently wrote, matter of fact, and today you wrote a new guest column for the Star. You wrote in that we're currently living in the third act of your film, CSA, the Confederate States of America. Could you explain what you mean by that and tell us your view about the current debate regarding Confederate names and the history of slavery?
Sure. Well, in my film, CSA, Confederate States of America, I made in 2004. And it's about what happens when the South wins the Civil War. And what I kind of quickly realized when I made that film was that the South really kind of did win the Civil War. obviously they lost on the battlefield, but they won in their attempt to hold on to their way of life. And for me, what I learned from making that film was that America's always kind of been two countries, and we're the USA and we're the CSA. Mm-hmm. And it's been a struggle ever since to which country is going to be dominant, which country is really going to control our way of life. And by losing the war, in many ways, the South won, because the North sympathized with the South. That's when Jim Crow laws become part of American life. Presidents like Woodrow Wilson support movies like Birth of a Nation, and they personally endorse that film. It's shown in the White House, where, for those who may not know, the Klan, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan are the good guys in that film. And so it's been a really a metaphor for our actual lives for a very long time. And it's great now to see us finally kind of coming terms with that. I mean, one of the things that people don't understand, I think, is that that when those statues were created, they were created around the turn of the century on up to the 1950s, and really about the 1950s. And in fact, the one on Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is a highly contested monument, of a huge monument to the Confederacy on Stone Mountain, Georgia. That's where the Klan originated, was on that mountain. And that monument was created as a response to the Brown decision, the Topeka Board of Education decision. And so those statues are not just in the South; they are all over the country. And as far as New England states, and so it's all kind of indicative of how we embrace what's called the lost cause, which is how we view how we like to really view American history.
Professor, in your column, you wrote that we are currently living in a rolling civil war here in the United States. Do you see any glimmer of hope the conversation we having now about race and reform will end that?
Yeah, I think it's a very hopeful time right now. I think, when I made the film, I made it out of total frustration. The flag was flying over the state of South Carolina. Obviously, it was on the Mississippi flag. You still see it on numerous cars all over the area, and there was no questioning of it. No one was even talking about it. It was not even an issue, really, to a large degree. And so the fact that states that Mississippi of all states took that flag down, right, that people are taking those Confederate monuments down, that's a huge step forward.
Okay. Now, you are real transparent about growing up in Junction City, Kansas, and some of the racism you experienced there. Does that your upbringing have a lot to do with your activism?
Sure, I think it does. Of course it does. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the dilemma of being an American, really, is that you see it the way people talk about the virus even. It's like, well, I don't know anybody that's been sick. I don't know anybody that's died. And so then they don't believe it. They don't believe that the virus is real. And it's you can apply that same metaphor to racism. People that have experienced it know it's real, but people that have not experienced it, they have a hard time believing that it's real. And so it's kind of secondhand eyewitness testimony that they're hearing, really. And they have a hard time believing it. And that's kind of the dilemma with racism in the country, is that people don't believe it, even though it's obviously very real.
Okay, and could you relay one of those experiences you had in Junction City, Kansas, growing up that kind of sparked your activism?
Sure. Well, I think I was thrown out of high school. And I was thrown out of high school in my junior year. And there were race riots in my high school. And I was always a good kid, never got in trouble, was a pretty good student for the most part. But it was hard for me to see other kids their lives being destroyed. And you knew that a lot of these kids that were being kicked out of school, they weren't coming back. And one of the kind of dilemmas of I think young people go through is that when you're kind of sharp enough to kind of know what's going on, and you kind of see the racism that's kind of permeating through everything, and no one acknowledges it, and you really have no one to talk to about it. Really, it's a very difficult thing to go through, and fortunately, I was kicked out of school, and that incident changed my life, and that's how I ended up getting to college, and I think ultimately winning an Oscar. So but it was because I acted on the things I was seeing. I didn't just stay silent within the racism and the oppression that I was witnessing. I acted upon it. I spoke out about it and got in trouble for it. And I've never regretted that. It's been probably the best thing I've done in my whole life in many ways.
Okay, and over the course of the last month, protests have been held throughout the country, here in Missouri, here in Kansas, throughout the country. Some of the issues you've been talking about for years. What happens next? Where do we go from here?
Sure. Well, I think one of the great things about this moment that we're having is that we truly are purging the CSA from the country, and the fact that the Redskins are changing the name of their team. All of those things are huge step forwards. And I think a lot of people think, well, it's just the name of a team, but it's a representation of that history that we have to come to terms with, and that we have to understand, and we ultimately have to reject. And that's the thing that we're doing right now. And so that's a huge step forward. I think the other thing is that we have to keep this moment going, and we have to continue this discussion of race. That's why what you're doing today is so great, because Black people, most Black people, talk about race all the time because they can't escape it, really. But white people as a whole don't have to talk about race, and they're the ones that have to become more comfortable with it, and Black people have to become more comfortable with them in their discomfort. And it is both of us trying to move that honest conversation forward, that real democracy and real change will continue to happen in the country.
Okay, I thank you for that. And before we move on to our next segment, Professor, and let you go, would you mind answering a question or two from our audience?
Sure.
Okay, this is a two-part inquiry from Gail Richardson. The first question is, how would you change the white privilege culture we all swim in KC Metro and also in Kansas?
Well, I think those kind of things are hard to change from the outside. I think education is a huge part of that. I think one of the things you see with the young white kids in the street protesting with African Americans and Latinos and everybody is that those young people have learned about white privilege, and they've learned the history of this country, and they've learned the other side of America. And that's a huge thing. And I think, people that don't really know that history, I see people commenting about, well, on social media, well, why are you upset about maple syrup, and why are you upset about rice? And the fact that people don't know what uncle and aunt even mean, those kind of examples are much bigger, or small examples of a bigger problem. And that bigger problem is ultimately white privilege, where ultimately you don't have to learn about my history. You don't have to learn about how racism is embedded within all the pores of the country, really. You don't have to learn about any of that unless you choose to do that. And so that's the thing that education can really do. We need to talk more about it. We need to, I continue to try to make movies about it. It needs to become part of the normal life of American citizenship. And when that becomes part of the norm, then I think we'll continue to push that away.
Okay, and the second part of that question, a Black student at K-State University in Manhattan, Kansas, stated that students of color were being offered counseling if they were concerned about racist activities on campus. Her response was that instead of counseling the victims, the university should concentrate on making the campus safer and created a welcome experience for these students. How do you respond to that?
I think there's an element of truth to that. I think that KU, that all universities, it's a challenge for uh, diversity is a challenge. It's just a challenge. It's a challenge in American life, and I think because of the president sending out this "okay with racism" message to everyone, incidents of racism have been cropping up a lot more on college campuses, and it makes it harder for diversity to reign as a safe and communal place, and so that's a real challenge, and so I think it's two-part. We have to really work harder at acknowledging that it's a challenge. We can't think that it's just always okay. I think the fact that we end up kind of, resting on our laurels in a lot of ways is where a lot of these problems end up occurring. I mean, we kind of fall asleep at the wheel a bit. And so if we kind of acknowledge that as a problem, that and then we're proactive and we do programs and we do things to kind of keep new, especially new students that come to those campuses, especially Black students and others that are from big city environments where they're not around a lot of whites. We're still very segregated in this country, and so those students especially have to feel like they're accepted and that they're appreciated. And universities have to do their part to make that happen.
Outstanding. I knew you would probably want to weigh in on that, being a KU guy yourself. Well, let's go to wrap up our opening segment with KU film professor Kevin Willmott. Professor Willmott, thank you for joining us to lend your voice to this impactful, important, and long overdue conversation. We look forward to more of your thought-provoking work that highlights the injustices of America.
Hey, thank you, my brothers. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Next up, we want to welcome to the panel two men who do not need introductions. Kansas City Mayor Quinn Lucas and U.S. Congressman Emanuel Cleaver II, the first Black mayor in Kansas City. Quinn Lucas is the 55th mayor of KCMO. He previously served on the Kansas City Council and is a faculty member at the University of Kansas Law School. Emanuel Cleaver is in his seventh term representing Missouri's 5th district. He was Kansas City's first African-American mayor, as I said, and served 8 years in that job after being elected in 1991. Thank you both for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Mayor Lucas, we will start with you. The DOJ, the United States Department of Justice, recently announced an anti-crime initiative dubbed Operation Legend. According to the White House, the crime-fighting plan was named after 4-year-old Legend Taliaferro, who was shot and killed while asleep here in his bed in Kansas City, Missouri. Where do you stand with Operation Legend? Do you feel the DOJ is sincere about removing violent criminals off the streets, or was the announcement a political ploy?
I had the chance to visit with the United States Attorney here in Kansas City yesterday. He is a good man. However, I think some of his bosses and superiors, I'll say respectfully, are not. I think that there was much to be said for it trying to be an announcement that related to some of the president's rhetoric about Democratic-run cities, Black-run cities, that sort of thing. Even though if you look at a city like this one, our police department's run by Board of Police Commissioners. Much of our ability to change some of the important rules that constrict our ability to improve our community are controlled at the state level in Jefferson City. And so I think that the politics were largely a part of it. I do think that all of us want to find solutions to violent crime issues, want to find the murderer of Legend Taliaferro, want to find a lot of these folks who have been terrorizing our community. And I think the way you do that is perhaps through investigative support, is through support certainly on a number of our other resources that are tangential to crime fighting, including mental health services, like our mental health triage center at 12th and Prospect. But no, we don't need tanks coming in to take over or large numbers of outside forces. I'm heartened by the fact that that's not what the program sounds like. And I think we all would have benefited from a little bit more clarity about that from the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Congressman Cleaver, I'll kick it over to you. You stated publicly that you were blindsided by the DOJ's announcement. What are your thoughts on the operation as it stands today? And should the feds have consulted you, Mayor Lucas, or Kansas City Police Chief Rick Smith about his pending crime fighting initiative?
Well, thank you for asking me that question. Actually, I can tell you something that can be confirmed very rather easily. Neither did Senator Blunt nor any member of the Missouri delegation received any kind of word about that plan to bring federal investigators, law enforcement people into the city. And as I spoke to Senator Blunt, who I consider to be a real friend, not the Washington friendship stuff, but a real friend. And he said, "Look, I didn't know about it, and if I had known, I would have called you." And I said, and if you had called me, I would have said, "Please go back and tell General Barr that he may have the best plan that has ever been conceived if it's real and serious and genuinely designed to be of help to Kansas City, but that there has to be some community work done before that happens, because in the absence of communication, you open the door for imagination." And I had people telling me that the troops were going to be marching down the street. There were going to be tanks and aircraft carriers and submarines and B-2 bombers, and so I'm not sure what was going on. Whatever it was, the announcement was not helpful because it created a tumult that did not have to happen. And had they contacted the mayor, Mayor Lucas, or me, I think either of us would have said, not until the community starts talking. And even if the community disagreed, it's infinitely better to be able to say, I've already had many conversations with community leaders. They disagree with us, but I think we're going to try this anyway, and we'll back off if we find that much of what they said is true. So no, I wasn't not given any information about it at all. I found out about it on the news.
Okay, thank you, sir. And Mayor Lucas, I want to come back to you. Part of this panel we put together, one of the topics is criminal justice reform, police reform, and things of that nature. The Star recently reported that among the 100 largest cities in the country, KC is the only one that has not adopted any use of force reforms recommended by the nonprofit group Campaign Zero. Why is that, Mayor? And what does that say about our police department?
I think I'll say a few things about it and our police department. First things first, I do know the reforms that we have put in place. After the protests actually started, I called a special meeting of the Board of Police Commissioners. We are now referring all officer-involved shootings to an outside agency. We think that's been an important step. We are continuing to, and I think ultimately next month, we'll change the use of force policy so you do not say things like tear gas deployed on peaceful protesters. Those will be important steps, and I think those are part of the steps that'll be at issue. In terms of any other changes that we need to make, I think we need to continue to push towards it. There are several that I propose relating not just to the Office of Community Complaints and having greater independence, but also requiring third-party whistleblower reporting of one officer if someone else is committing misconduct. Those are the sorts of things that will make a world of difference for us. So I do think that we have work to do. We have a lot of it to do. In some ways, the institution doesn't move fast enough. A once-a-month meeting at a time where you're seeing these numbers of issues, I think is inadequate. And I'll stay committed to making sure we make that change.
Okay, and Congressman, Kansas City, Missouri is your hometown. Where do you stand on police reform here in this city?
Well, I think we need to have what I've been calling re-engineering of policing. That is not related to nor in any way have kinship with this ridiculous call to defund the police. What I'm saying is that we need to have a number of new components of the police designed and implemented for service. For example, I have a friend in this town whose son was schizophrenic. He called the police one day about his son having an episode. He was out in the front yard with a butcher knife, waving it around. His father tried to disarm him, couldn't. He called the police here in Kansas City. And to make a long story short, his son was shot, I think, 13 times in the front yard. This was a white guy, a friend of mine, used to be a principal here in Kansas City, still lives here. And he doesn't hate the police, but I think he would tell you right now that if there had been a a division of the police department that could have come out like the Bobbies do with shields and surround a guy and disarm him and give him medication. There's a problem solved and a life saved. So we're talking about re-engineering, and I don't think that there is much opposition to that in Kansas City, or at least I have not. Mayor Lucas would know better than I, but I don't think that there would be. I think most people, most thoughtful people, most sensitive people realize that you can't call on the police to do everything. You know, my cow looks like it's going to have a calf. Can you send a police officer out to help? You know, it's time to do the benediction at church. Can you send a police officer? No matter what, we want to send police, and I think that's unfair to them.
Thank you. Mayor Lucas, back to you. During recent protests, you were very vocal during a protest at City Hall when you stated the revolution will not be televised. Now, you mentioned some of the reforms you guys have implemented at the Kansas City Police Board, but what does revolution look like to you in Kansas City?
Yeah, my view is that if you think that this conversation in this moment is only about what a Kansas City police officer is doing in a patrol division here, then I think you're missing the point. This is, and when I talk about revolutions and changes, and I get some flack for it, but I think it is changing incarceration. It's changing who's getting locked up, for how long, for what offenses. It's addressing the criminal justice system. A few specifics. Last week, you saw the Kansas City, Missouri City Council in an outstanding choice vote to decriminalize marijuana in Kansas City, Missouri by removing it from our criminal code. The idea that we're saying we're getting out of this business. You know, everybody gives a lot of rhetoric to the drug war has been a failure. We give a lot of rhetoric to wanting to make things fair in the criminal justice system. The fairest way to do it is to get rid of a lot of the criminal laws that are holding people back. This week, I plan to introduce the Kansas City City Council an ordinance that will eliminate the ability to have an arrest warrant issued if you have failed to pay a parking ticket or non-moving violation. It's those very simple things that have criminalized entire communities. And so that's why, right, I hear a lot of people say a lot of things about what's happening now. And it's very attractive and perhaps interesting to look at a protest because in some ways it is, you know, kind of almost a thing that's visual. But we have to look through all of the laws in our code of ordinances, our state laws, our federal laws. We need to look at incarceration and see where there's unfairness. And I'll bring one example, very particular. Robert Courtney, a pharmacist who diluted drugs, sold to 4,200 patients, many of whom died, gets a wonderful early release relating to COVID-19. He's a white gentleman. And I think this is the sort of thing where you see gross inequality in this situation, the Bureau of Prisons, and how we address issues. You have that at every step of the level. So yeah, it sounds like this is a conversation about just policing, but we need to make it a conversation that is much broader.
Now, Mayor, you did mention you took a hit for the revolution will not be televised statement, but you also took a hit for the public letter you wrote in support of the police department and the chief after people were tear gassed and pepper sprayed. How have you responded to that criticism?
So I would say this first. I didn't actually credit the chief on that. I've got this view of the world that maybe is a little crazy, but I know the congressman was an outstanding mayor for this city for some time too. There are people like myself, Emmanuel Cleaver, Rick Smith, who get in these positions and can and should take a lot of flack and can and should take a lot of criticism. And there are other people who go out and do their jobs most days. You know, if you got a problem with potholes in Kansas City, and from what I hear, a lot of people do, that's not the fault of the guy who's filling the potholes. That's the fault of Quentin Lucas. That's the fault of the city manager and the public works director. I think largely, if you have a problem with the way that the police do things in this city, none of those officers who were out there during the protest or any other times were actually ones who were making the orders to use tear gas, making the orders to have people in riot gear, making the orders to clear out a park, or making the orders to frankly create any of the laws that disproportionately impact Black people every day. So I think it is a total cop-out for elected officials to kind of act like police are some magical thing that's unrelated to anything we do. So on the converse of that to me is that I believe that, yeah, I'm going to make sure that I say, look, if you're normal folks who are doing your job and you work for Kansas City, Missouri, and you haven't screwed up, you yourselves haven't, then yeah, I'm not going to throw you under the bus. I'm going to say thank you for what you do, no matter the department, no matter the area. Now, if you're folks that have issues and have challenges, and I've disagreed with what the chief has done on a number of times, even if the star forgets it, I mean that with love. You know, I think that's where I see the dichotomy. because we're spending so much time acting like the police officer driving down the street is the one who created this system that's unequal. I don't think that's the case. I think the issue is we need to figure out how we can change things at the elected side, at the leadership side, and I do hold the police chief accountable on that.
Okay, thank you, sir. Congressman, I want to kick it back to you. Some of the criticism that we heard here at the start leading up to this event was, give us examples of systemic racism. Kansas City has had 3 black mayors. You have millionaire athletes. How do you respond to people who talk like that?
Well, unfortunately, many African Americans, and probably to a degree Latinos as well, when they see someone in a position of significance in municipal, state, or even federal government, the assumption is that those people can correct all of the problems. I listened to a lady tell me, well, we had Eric Holder as the Attorney General, so why should this police issue still continue? And I can understand this inflated expectation, this unrealistic expectation that Barack Obama coming to the White House solves all of the problems. And there were a lot of people who thought that finally the issues of race are going to be defeated and trampled upon by the power of Barack Hussein Obama. It did not happen. Eric Holder could not stop all these issues. What you have, however, are people who've gone through the Black experience, people who know what it's like to be Black, and who use that experience legislatively. Now, I think some people get things mixed up. They want one of the things that Dr. Ralph Abernathy, who followed Dr. King as head of SCLC, told me over and over again when I started talking to him about running for the city council. He said, just keep in mind, you cannot legislate and agitate at the same time. You have to choose. And he said, now, for those of us who are still out here in the civil rights arena, we agitate, you legislate. And we hope that how we agitate will give you a lot more power as you legislate. So, I expect to hear that. Mayor Lucas is going to hear that for as long as he's in office. That's just the way it is. There's nothing we're going to be able to do about that.
Okay, thank you. We are coming to the end of our second segment, but before we let you go, Mayor, Congressman, let's take some submitted questions from our viewers. Mayor, I'll start with you. Felicia Peoples wants to know, do you think systemic racism is to blame for the violence in the metropolitan area?
In the broadest sense, yes. I think that the way that we have built and developed communities, I think the way that we do not teach our young people adequately about conflict resolution, de-escalation, relates in many ways to the patterns in which we live. So I think it does contribute. I think the bigger question is, how do we deal with it? How do we address it long term? And I think, and I appreciate the congressman's point on legislation and agitation, because what we have to do is say, not only are we trying to build a better society for the future, I know Dr. Bedell will talk to you about that, but we got to make sure that we don't have people getting killed today. We got to make sure that we're solving crimes today. We have to make sure that we're giving alternatives. So I absolutely agree that systemic racism is a part of it. That's why I was talking about the criminal laws and the things that we can change long term. But, we also have to make sure we're talking to the people each day, getting that pride in ourselves and our own community, try to look to a way that we can get past this, I think, tragic moment in our city.
Okay, and Congressman, Donna Poe wants to know, what would you recommend each person do to address systemic racism in their community?
Well, I think, first of all, make a personal commitment that they're not going to tolerate it, and that they will address it whenever it raises its nasty and vulgar head. I think too many times things happen, people say things and do things, and we allow them to escape. And so I think you don't have to be the head of the municipality. You don't have to be the head of the NAACP or Operation Breadbasket or whatever in order to be a power in the area of civil rights. You can speak up individually, but you can also become a member of the NAACP of the Urban League, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of La Raza. I mean, you can do those things that will empower those institutional civil rights organizations to be much more robust in their defense of liberty and democracy and freedom. So we all play a role. And the last thing that anybody should do is drink a cup of coffee watching George Floyd die and say, boy, somebody ought to do something. This is terrible. Somebody ought to do something. Everybody is somebody, and everybody can do something.
Outstanding. Mayor Lucas, the third African-American mayor in Kansas City. Congressman Cleaver, the first.
The younger.
We want to thank you. We definitely want to thank you guys for joining us. Please stay safe.
Thank you.
Okay. Shifting gears. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed disparities that have long existed in the healthcare system and have long been ignored. People of color are becoming infected and dying at much higher rates. Joining the panel now to discuss those disparities are Kiana Thomason, President and CEO of Health Forward Foundation in Kansas City, and Kansas City Public Schools Superintendent Mark Bedell, who will weigh in on how the coronavirus pandemic has exposed the disparities within the public school system here in the metro area as well. Dr. Bedell is considered one of the top urban public schools administrators in the country. In 2007, he was named Superintendent to Watch by the National School Public Relations Association, and he was recognized as 2018 New Superintendent of the Year by the Missouri Association of School Administrators. Kiana Thomason is a lifelong Kansas Citian who has dedicated her career to the improvement of health, wellness across the region, with a special focus on communities with significant health disparities and those living in marginalized conditions. Thomason serves as the president and CEO of Health Forward Foundation. Kiana, let's dive right in. Why have communities of color been hit so hard by the coronavirus?
First, Toriano, thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, the COVID-19 pandemic has really just highlighted for mainstream America the fact that racism is still alive and very much the factor that is causing millions of Black and brown people across our country to be unwell. Statistically, people of color factor or fare far worse in all societal outcomes as compared to our white counterparts in education, in home ownership, and in so many other factors. Racism is the culprit of much of that and is the root cause of that. We know that systemic racism and structural racism has legally and through policy been a consistent barrier for many factors around education, home ownership, as well as banking. And so when you have those social complexities based on the policy structures that we live in, you will see in a pandemic, as we are in COVID-19, different outcomes that we prefer to call health injustices versus health disparities, because that's indeed what they are. It's important to name things as they are. And health disparities doesn't quite lend or provide the value attribution that health injustices does. And so we must begin to address these systemic challenges from a policy perspective, making sure that we apply a health and all policies lens to our community policies in Kansas City. So inclusionary zoning is health policy, and transportation policy around Ride KC and zero fare is health policy. So we must begin to look at these things holistically and as pieces of a whole for optimal health.
Thank you. And Dr. Bedell, the digital divide in Kansas City public schools and other districts became far more pronounced during the last few months when students were sent home for online education. The path forward for the next school year is still uncertain. Are minority students in danger of being left behind simply because many don't have computers or Wi-Fi at home?
Absolutely. And it's a major concern that we have as superintendents, especially superintendents in urban school districts, where we realize that the digital inequities reared its head once COVID-19 hit us at the end of March. As a school district, we've been committed to working with our students. We allowed for all of our students who are at the high school level to take home devices. So in many cases, a number of those students were probably better prepared for this scenario than our students that are in the primary years and even some of our middle schoolers. And what we learned was that there were a number of families that simply did not have the internet connectivity. So as a school district, we had a partnership with Sprint, where we were able to offer hotspots to our high schoolers that could not afford it. We started that partnership back in 2016 or 17 or so. But as you think about the number of families and where they live in terms of that poverty level, or whether they're living in extreme poverty, we had the same thing that's similar to what we coined as grocery store deserts when I first started here. We have that now with the Wi-Fi scenario. And as a school district, we've purchased a number of hotspots. And the thing I like to share with people around the hotspots is that it serves as a bandage. It gives our students opportunities to access the online curriculum. But when you think about doing video conferencing, as we're doing right now, that quality takes a significant hit because the bandwidth is not where it needs to be. That is the reason why I am working alongside the Urban League and a number of other community leaders to address the Wi-Fi disparities that exist, not only here inside of the urban centers or urban core that I serve, but even in some of our rural areas where they don't have towers to have that accessibility. And so we know on the 21st of July, there will be a fireside chat that will take place around addressing the Wi-Fi disparities and trying to figure out how can we inform and influence policy in a way where we can make broadband a reality for our families, because that is the way that we're moving in this country. A lot of businesses now being conducted virtually, and we don't want families being further left behind.
Right now, I'm sorry about that, Dr. Bedell, but you were real vocal. You have been vocal. Your career has been vocal about equity in education. What does equity in education look like in Kansas City Public Schools?
In my opinion, one of the things I did during the first 100 days of my tenure was I engaged the community around a series of questions, and we talked about equity and what does that look like. We talked about oppression. We talked about marginalization that exists in this city. And it was before I started reading a number of books that are written on the Kansas City experience. And honestly, what I learned is that we didn't have an equity policy. So I immediately approached our board and said, we need to put an equity policy in so that we can do everything in our power to level the playing field when you think about the disparities that exist in certain communities. So if you think about the central feeder pattern, that is a feeder pattern where we have our highest percentage of mobility. It's also a feeder pattern where we have been hit with violence for whatever reason. And we know that the mobility, people are in and out. There's no constant in terms of what happens in that feeder pattern. So that makes it a lot more difficult on our schools. Our students show up with a lot more of distress and trauma. And when I think about the lack of economic development that has occurred in those communities, the grocery store deserts that exist within some of those communities, we knew that we needed to do more as a school system. We needed to put in a tiered model of support that would require for us to apply an equity lens. So we adopted an equity policy 0.0 in 2018. It took us a year and a half to come to one voice on it, but we now have an equity policy that guides how we're going to direct resources to our schools based on a series of variables that we use to calculate in order to make sure that we have a level playing field for our kids, regardless of zip code, regardless of socioeconomic status. We're going to give every single one of our kids an equitable educational experience, and it's through how we design our equity policy.
Okay, and Kiana, I'll pose this question to you. As we talked about in the opening segment, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted those inequities in health care. Now, you used another term, and we'll get together and we'll talk about that because I want to educate myself as well. But these problems were long evident before the pandemic hit. We've discussed that. What are the systemic changes we need to make in our approach to healthcare?
Well, systemically, we need to center racial equity throughout the healthcare ecosystem and throughout our city's policy landscape. So what does that mean? So racial equity simply means that an individual's racial identity has absolutely no bearing on their ability to thrive and self-actualize in life. And so in doing that, Health Forward, number one, has, with our board support, is centering racial equity in our grant making, in our advocacy agenda, and in our internal operations. And in doing that, our number one priority is to ensure that Yes on 2, the Amendment 2 for Medicaid expansion, passes on August 4th. That will allow, is the lowest hanging fruit coming through COVID-19, that will allow all individuals, particularly Black and Brown individuals, to receive access to care. Access to care was the number one issue that contributed to Black and Brown people's overrepresentation in the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's first and foremost. We must pass Medicaid expansion. Secondly, our states, Missouri and Kansas, need to prioritize right-sizing funding for public health infrastructure. Both Missouri and Kansas are woefully underfunded. Missouri ranks the 50th state in public health funding. Kansas ranks the 47th state in public health funding. Kansas spends $12 per person on public health funding. Missouri spends just less than $6 per person on public health funding, and the average is around $50 per person in the U.S. So that's a state issue. We need to right size. The federal government needs to up the ante in terms of its contribution to public health spending, as that's been decreasing for the past 30 years. There's been a downward trend from, I think, 50% contribution to public health spending at the state level all the way down to 15% just 2 or 3 years ago. So Medicaid expansion, public health infrastructure. I think we also need to apply a reparative framework when we talk about racial equity in healthcare. So it's great that we are seeing all of these statues come down across our country. It's wonderful to see. I say that that is more of a cosmetic issue, and we need to get to true reparative work in terms of policy. So in healthcare, what that looks like is ensuring that our hospitals, our systems are prioritizing ensuring that our workforce is diverse, which will reduce health injustices. When you have Black and Brown individuals serving and providing care for Black and Brown individuals, that is one significant way to ensure that medical apartheid and racism is mitigated in the healthcare experience, which we know is a true issue in looking at the huge health injustice of infant mortality and maternal mortality. On average, Black and Brown women, especially Black women, die at 4 times the rate of our white female counterparts in our childbearing years during pregnancy and postpartum. Even when you control for socioeconomic status and you neutralize that as an issue, you still see that we die 4 times higher. So that allows us to take socioeconomics out of the conversation with respect to maternal mortality, health injustices, and center medical racism in that issue. So health systems need to adopt that framework with respect to making sure that their workforce is adequately resourced and making sure that their quality outcomes are focusing on health injustices in chronic condition management and all these different types of measures that adversely affect Black and Brown people. Philanthropically, we have a role to play in philanthropy. So we know that African Americans, by and large, built this country. It was our sweat equity that built this country. So how does philanthropy need to adjust when we think about access to capital for organizations that are led by Black and Brown individuals? we need to own the fact that racism has affected and infected philanthropy just as it has every other sector in our society. And so in partnership with our board, our Community Advisory Council, and my team, we are working diligently to ensure that we apply a race equity lens, not only in our advocacy agenda, but also in our grant making to ensure that access to capital is available to organizations that might be smaller, that may be led by Black and Brown people who carry the trust of Black and Brown communities, and oftentimes are locked out of capital as they don't have necessarily the scale and the infrastructure that other larger organizations do. So there's a host of opportunities for us to consider with respect to baking equity in systemically across the healthcare ecosystem.
Thank you for weighing in on that, Kiana. I really appreciate that. We, the viewers, appreciate that as well. Dr. Bedell, back to you. Gun violence in Kansas City, Missouri has hit young African-American men hard. In fact, several Kansas City public school students, Hickman Mill students, and Granville students have been fatally shot. These districts, as you know, are overwhelmingly Black. How can we as a community ensure each and every student not only has a chance to succeed, but survive past their 18th birthday?
That's a very difficult question, especially after reading an email that I just received a few minutes ago from one of our head football coaches, where we allowed for our athletic teams to come back on the 15th to start practice. And this coach just sent me an email literally 40 minutes ago expressing the importance of why we need to have positive adult advocates in front of our students, because two of his players have lost family members during this period here where we've experienced the shootings. And the record right now, we're ahead of where we were year to date ever, I guess, since we've been tracking this data. And some of these kids have fallen into depression because of that. Some of these kids have said, when asked the question, one of our board members met with some of our students over at one of the practices, and he asked the question, what can the district do? And the response from one of our students was, I need a life coach. So as you think about how kids have to cope with the trauma that comes with the murders and the violence, or having to live through that as they are trying to sleep, they need to have thought partners. They need to have adult advocates in this community. That is the reason why we have promoted our mentoring program, because we know that the kids that get connected with a positive adult advocate, we have seen GPAs go up, disciplinary infractions go down, we have seen graduation rates go up, we have seen involvement from an extracurricular standpoint, social and emotional development standpoint go up. And you're one of those people that have come in and you've helped us with the mentoring. But if we can get all of these kids paired with a positive adult advocate, we can change the whole landscape of what Kansas City looks like in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you. And before we wrap this segment up with you guys, we're going to take some questions from the audience. Kiana, this one is from you. This one is for you from a gentleman by the name of Alan Zagier. He wants to know, what role can Medicaid expansion in Missouri and Kansas play toward reducing some of the pervasive health and economic disparities in our community?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, access to care is the #1 barrier that Black and Brown people have and contributed to the health injustices in COVID. So Medicaid expansion will provide individuals who make less than $18,000 a year and families of 3 who make less than $26,000 a year. It will allow them to have the necessary coverage for health and behavioral health care and a host of services to ensure that they're healthy and that they're well. It will also ensure that providers, practitioners, clinicians receive the reimbursement that they need to adequately resource services to provide the communities, which ultimately impacts the quality of care that people receive as well. From a rural perspective, It will help keep rural hospitals open. There's a trend at play across America where rural hospitals are closing on a daily basis. We've seen 10 rural hospitals shut down in Missouri since 2014, and rural communities are being devastated by this. So this is not only providing healthcare for rural communities, but we also know that hospitals are anchor institutions for employment in rural communities. And so it will have an impact on that as well. Alan.
Thank you. Dr. Burdell, the name of this program is Breaking Point Kansas City. A couple of weeks ago, it seems to me you and the district had reached your breaking point when it comes to tax incentives and tax breaks for billion-dollar corporations. A reader by the name of Robert Franks wants to know, what policies do you think would be effective in tackling racial inequality in Kansas City?
As I think about economic development, and that letter I know received a lot of attention, it's not about the tool that's in place. I believe the tool is a good tool when it is used appropriately. And what I'm advocating for is an adherence to ensuring that the school district and other taxing jurisdictions have an opportunity to be at the table and to be able to have dialogue about where these projects are taking place. And when we think about equity, and I have said this to both of our mayors, which I've gotten along with both of them very well, that I have concerns around the number of projects that are taking place east of Troost. How do we entice and utilize the tool to get more revitalization in those communities so that we can then have employment opportunities and walking distance for families east of Troost, where transportation doesn't become a variable. But when I think about policy and what needs to change, we have shared multiple times that there are tools already in place that just need to be applied and utilized. I want the same type of treatment that our superintendents get in the Northland when they are at the table. So even if they have a bad deal that comes through, at least they've been made aware. And what happened a couple of weeks ago was that we didn't get an opportunity to be at the table. And you had BlueScope, a company, asking, after they've gotten 20 years of incentives, to now be granted another 15 years, or they're threatening to leave. And then it's moving through committees. District's not at the table. We find out at the 12th hour that this project looks like it's going to have the votes to get through. And that is the straw that broke the back of us, because we just want to be at the table. We are working with our elected officials on TIF reform, and we know that there's an ordinance that is in the process of going through. We're working with those authors of that ordinance to take a better look at how can we make sure that we get some reform in there that will ensure that what we want to see happen in a more equitable manner begins to happen in Kansas City.
Outstanding, outstanding. We are just about out of time. I wanted to personally show gratitude to both Dr. Mark Burdell and Kiana Thomason for lending their voices to this critical conversation on the disparities affecting people of color in the health and educational areas. The truth is often difficult to discuss, so we commend you both and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so to Dr. Burdell, Kiana, Mayor Quentin Lucas, U.S. Congressman Emmanuel Cleaver II, and Professor Kevin Willmott, we want to say thank you for taking the time to take part in this dialogue. We also like to thank all of you for being a part of this important discussion today. As a reminder, you can watch Breaking Point, Tackling Systemic Racism in Kansas City at kansascity.com or the Star's Facebook page or YouTube. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.